Hello, SSE 826, and welcome to week 2. In this video, we're going to take a broad look at the key elements of an emergency preparedness and response plan, and we'll also discuss a few general strategies for gaining stakeholder buy-in and support for the development of an emergency response and preparedness plan. But before we get started, it's important for us to address some background matters. First, if you were to ask 3 different safety and emergency management professionals to list the key elements of an emergency response, emergency action plan, and then compare those lists, I'm certain that you'd see some of the same common elements listed, but you'd also see some unique elements listed on each professional's list. And the reason for these differences can largely stem from the professional's background, meaning their education, their training, their experiences, and the particular organizations that serve as the framework from where they draw their lists. So if you ask any professional to develop this list for you, you're going to get a lot of the same key elements, but you're also going to get some different ones too. And I want to address this early on in the video this week and let you know that there's no one right way to do this. There are some common critical elements that must be included in your EAP plan, but there are also going to be some elements that are going to be unique depending upon the type of organization that's been selected. So in determining the key elements for any emergency action plan, the organization for which it's developed will be really the driving force behind what must and should be included. Similarly, the organization and its processes and operations determine what regulatory requirements apply, and in turn, what elements must be included in order to be in compliance. Inevitably, students, and yes, even graduate students, clamor for a magic recipe or a fill-in-the-blank type template that sets forth precisely what their EAP plan, or their EAP, I should say, must include or what it must state. But I want to reiterate, the EAPs, maybe more so than any other program or policy that safety professionals write, it's never more important for it to be customized than with emergency action planning. It's been said that safety is an R&D business, meaning that it is rip off and duplicate. That type of rip off and duplicate, however, is likely to produce an EAP that's maybe not compliant, and it certainly won't perform as it should. So students are encouraged to think critically about the organizations they choose for the project in this class and create a plan that matches the organization's operations and not necessarily another plan. While we can often get some great ideas by looking at other plans and what other organizations have done, and I'm not saying you shouldn't research and analyze other entities' plans, but what I am trying to encourage you to do is to make sure that you adapt and not merely adopt another plan. It's for these reasons I'm a little hesitant to give a very precise, specific outline or recipe for what must be included in the EAP plans. For my fear is that students will make their organization plan fit this model rather than making a plan fit the needs of an organization. But we will try to balance that in this class, as I know you can get good ideas from other programs and you can get put in the right direction. But I don't want to swing the pendulum too far one way or the other. I do want you to think critically and learn how to apply these concepts to your particular organization rather than making your organization fit some template. So finally, students should keep in mind that while many regulations and NFPA 1600 set forth requirements for the elements that must be included in a program, the standards and regulations are very performance-oriented. For those of you who are new to the SSEM program or may not have yet heard the difference between a performance and specification standard, just know that performance standards outline the objective that must be achieved. And how the organization achieves that objective is largely up to that organization. Specification standards, on the other hand, specify precisely how an organization must achieve compliance. Standards and regulations on EAPs are generally very performance-oriented, and therefore it's imperative for this class to keep in mind that there's no one right way to draft a plan. As a word of caution, however, me saying there's no one right way does not excuse inadequate plans or plans that address elements in a mere cursory fashion. And what I'm referring to there is statements that would in a program such as "we will call the fire department" or "we'll do a head count." That's insufficient. You're going to have to describe how you would account for people on an evacuation. I hope that clarifies that. Now, I'm not going to necessarily take exception with your system of accounting for people as long as it isn't some cursory statement like "we'll do a head count" and that's it. So I hope that clears that up. Now, let's get started here exploring some more of the elements of an EAP. Now, as we go through this, I want you to keep in mind that the focus of the agencies developing the standards is the driving force behind their respective required program elements. Keep in mind that OSHA's driving force, their mission is to protect workers. The EPA's driving force is to protect the environment, public health. The CDC does that too. The DOT protects the motoring public, and the NFPA is a public and or private sector organization in their communities. So that's the perspective that these various organizations are coming from when they prescribe the required elements for their programs. So as we go through, keep that in mind as you look at standards and regulations and wonder why one requires something and the other one does not. So without looking at standards and regulations, you can survey various organizations' emergency action plans and develop a list of generally accepted fundamental components / elements. Largely, these elements are outlined on this slide. This is not an exhaustive list. This is simply a summary list, if you will. So let's take a look at these elements. A commitment purpose section, authorities or incident command system. They define the emergencies. They'll have a section dealing with the detection and notification for various types of emergencies, shelter-in-place procedures, evacuation procedures, personnel accountability, whether it be in a shelter-in-place or evacuation scenario, emergency contact information. It's obviously critical. Then we have very specific types of emergencies over here on the right, such as procedures for dealing with fire, severe weather, hazardous chemical releases, workplace violence, earthquakes, critical shutdown type operations, and then also resources that could be used as well as how we maintain the operations of the company. Now, the commitment purpose statement should not be a mere generic statement such as safety first or we're committed. It should reflect a purposeful effort to develop a commitment statement, and it's one that really the organization's leadership have agreed upon and have committed themselves to support. Some type of incident command structures and authorities for the plan program will also be included. The ICS helps assure a chain of command for making decisions and pre-planning such ICS is critical for the quick, high-stress decisions that must be made during an emergency situation. Now, the program should also discuss and outline the various types of emergencies it contemplates. This tells the plan user what he can obtain guidance on by using the plan, and it tells what was contemplated when this plan was developed. A commonly missed element of these programs are provisions for detecting an emergency situation and how members of the organization, employees of the organization, will be notified when the emergencies take place. I can't tell you how many emergency action plans I've reviewed as a consultant, and they have great plans for evacuation, great plans for rally points. Yet, when I ask them, okay, how will the employees know a fire is occurring, or how will they know a severe weather situation is developing, there's a blank stare. So this is a commonly missed element, but it's an extremely critical one. Timely detection and notification is critical for the success of any plan. No matter how meticulous the plan is or how well developed it is, if an emergency goes undetected or members in the organization are not notified, or just as bad to not know what the notification means, the plan will be of no use and certainly little use at best. Detection and notification are critical components and may include things as simple as developing procedures or policies for monitoring a weather radio, weather warning system, to doing something more complex such as monitoring chemical process flow systems on a large bank of computer monitors or some type of reactor system, so that when emergency conditions develop, proper notification can be delivered out to the employees of the community. Shelter-in-place procedures, they're not merely a process of designating particular areas such as bathrooms for a safe place to hide during a tornado. Shelter-in-place procedures require evaluation of the particular prospective areas to determine if they're suitable for the types of emergencies contemplated. For instance, are they suitable to provide shelter in a tornado type situation? And also means of accounting for employees once they've evacuated into a shelter-in-place area, and procedures for calling all clear are absolutely essential and part of shelter-in-place. So that is much more than simply naming areas. It involves evaluation of the areas to make sure they're suitable. It involves a procedure for getting people there. It involves a procedure for accounting for people once they are there, a procedure for calling all clear and allowing people to leave those shelter-in-place areas. Procedures for evacuation should cover the process from the initiation of alarm or other notification that prompts evacuation to the evacuation process, to rally points, to personnel accountability, to re-entry procedures. So personnel accountability should be developed also for each type of response to emergency. Merely stating the organization will perform a head count is not a good practice. Procedures should be developed so that the precise personnel that were on site at the time of the evacuation, taking consideration absences, those personnel who arrived early or who left early for the day, can be reconciled to the personnel who evacuated and are actually at the rally point or gathering points. The procedures should also contain a list of emergency contact numbers. Obviously, the more robust the list is, the better emergency coordinators and leaders can expedite emergency and rescue services, as well as mitigation and business continuation services. But as inferred from the book, The Checklist Manifesto, such lists such as this can become too complex if not thoroughly organized and eventually fail in an emergency situation. So in some cases, lists should be arranged maybe in a couple different fashions. Once purely alphabetized by name, and then the other one might be categories of the various types of contact, and then alphabetical within that subdivision. So in addition to these general elements that maybe apply to various emergencies, specific steps, procedures, checklists, exercises, and drills for the specific types of emergencies reported on the right side of this slide should be developed, such as fire, severe weather, hazardous chemical releases, violence, earthquake, so on and so forth. These procedures will vary greatly based upon the type of the organization involved and the local community resources that are available. And we'll explore some of these emergencies in more detail as the course progresses. So now let's examine and compare those elements that are required by various regulations and standards. And as we do, you'll no doubt see a lot of commonalities, but you'll also notice some distinctions. Keep in mind, oftentimes the objective charge of the agency responsible for promulgating or developing a particular standard provides clues as to the rationale behind the various elements that they require. So first, we'll examine the elements required by OSHA's base level general industry standard on emergency action plans, 1910-38, and more specifically paragraph C. While this standard states that verbal plans may be permissible in this narrow exception of certain employers, it's widely accepted that committing a plan to writing helps ensure that you're going to be in compliance, and it'll also help ensure the effective execution of the plan. And you'll see the list of required elements are not that extensive when compared to the elements required by other regulatory and other consensus standards. So you'll see here contained in the 1910-38 are simply evacuation procedures, critical operations procedures, post-evac accountability, part of your evacuation system, procedures for employees performing rescue or medical duties, contact information, that's the list I mentioned earlier, and then training and review of the plan. And actually, in this standard, it just specifies that it takes place. The plan doesn't necessarily have to spell that out in it in order to be compliant. Obviously, you would want to do that as a best practice. So now let's take a look at the elements required by EPA's chemical accident prevention regulations, which include and many times are referred to synonymously, or right or wrong, with the risk management plan or EPA RMP regulations. And more specifically, this is 40 CFR section 68.95 or part 68.95. Again, we see commonalities of the elements, including detection and notification. But notice who this standard contemplates in the notification component. The public and the local emergency response agencies. It's essentially some external stakeholders. Elements such as first aid, chemical response procedures, equipment inventories, equipment inspections, employee training, and the periodic evaluation of the plan are common to this regulation like they are other OSHA regulations and even NFPA 1600. Please note, however, that this regulation mandates that an individual organization's plan be coordinated with community local emergency action plans, not merely involving or just considering the community emergency response agencies. This means an actual coordination with plans that they have developed. Again, this distinction is largely attributed to the objectives of the EPA, which is to protect the environment and the general public health. Well, I'm sure EPA does not want employees to be hurt or injured in an emergency situation. That's just not their focus. That's OSHA's focus. Interestingly, though, OSHA's HAZWOPER standard, which affects only those organizations that are involved in certain hazardous waste operations, cleanup operations, or facilities that are deemed treatment, storage, and disposal facilities, TSD facilities. Those are the ones that have to comply with OSHA's HAZWOPER standard. But you'll see in the HAZWOPER standard that there's also a requirement for coordination with local emergency response plans. Now, this probably is best reconciled by keeping in mind that coordination with these outside agencies also many times helps improve occupational safety. So keep in mind, EPA's focus on coordinating plans with the local authorities and their plans is tied to their mission and charge. So with that, let's go ahead and turn and take a look at some of the HAZWOPER standards. I realize this is a rather text-heavy slide and I'm violating a lot of PowerPoint rules of etiquette. However, this is provided for you as a resource as you go through this class as a supplemental instructional material, so I think it's probably okay that I violate some of those. So as we look at this, you'll see many of the common elements that you saw in other OSHA standards and or with the EPA regulations, but you also see some that are unique, that are usually seen with organizations involved with hazardous waste operations, such as the site security, evacuation distances, reporting release incidents, etc. So even those organizations that are not required to comply with OSHA's HAZWOPER standard, or even OSHA's PSM standard for that matter, should take note and consider the merits of including some of these elements in their plan. Elements such as site security, incident reporting, etc. They can prove beneficial even outside of the type of industry as contemplated by the HAZWOPER standard. Now let's go ahead and turn to take a look at NFPA 1600. I've provided a summary of the elements of an emergency management program that one could collectively gather by reading through chapters 4 through 9 of NFPA 1600. Again, you have to read through these chapters in order to synthesize down this list of key elements for an emergency management program, and you'll notice the pause. So this is probably a good time to note the difference in semantics with the NFPA standard. You may have already wondered why NFPA 1600 refers to an emergency management program instead of a plan. As one reads through NFPA 1600, it's readily apparent the standard contemplates a comprehensive approach to ensuring that plans are properly developed and improved, and also that there is a systematic, purposeful approach to managing all the elements of a plan. This list is provided as a supplemental outline of the elements, and you should reference NFPA 1600 and the related annexes to read more in depth about what's required. I want to draw your attention, though, to a unique requirement for emergency preparedness plans that NFPA 1600 sets forth. And this unique requirement is that the management program should have measurable performance objectives. In fact, NFPA 1600 requires measurable objectives be tied to each element of the management EAP plan. Measurable objectives do not simply mean a yes, no, present, not present checklist, which is somewhat contradictive of the self-assessment instrument you will find in the annex of NFPA 1600. But keep in mind that self-assessment is not portrayed as a measurable objective. It might be a starting point to developing those, but in and of itself it's not. Measurable objectives ties to the extent possible to quantities that represents a performance to goal standard. NFPA does not go into very much detail regarding how to do this, but instead leaves it up to the individual organization. The guidance they do provide is actually sage advice concerning any safety program. So, make sure that performance indicators are tied to human behaviors, make sure they're tied to human performance, make sure they're observable and measurable, and ensure that performance goals are established. That's wise advice for any safety program that you're developing. The common goal-setting mnemonic SMART is recommended by NFPA. That's specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, timely, and there's some other iterations of that model. Just keep in mind that the world of safety has made great strides in moving organizations to leading indicators of performance, and emergency response is no exception to that. Leading indicators focus on how safety systems are performing, not on lagging indicators such as accident data, meaning OSHA recordable incident rates, workers' comp loss data, things like that. So to conclude the lecture, I want to tag on to discussion board questions concerning obtaining stakeholder buy-in. Safety and emergency response professionals can invest a lot of time, a lot of resources, a lot of effort, and develop really exemplary plans and exemplary elements of the plans. But if the stakeholders are not engaged, not committed to the plan, it'll either fail or probably at least underperform. So while there are numerous theories, and there's probably a mountain of advice on gaining management buy-in and leadership support, a particular organization's culture and leadership determines what approaches are best. Here I've tried to summarize some of the best practices in obtaining stakeholder buy-in. These best practices, as I've developed here, pertain specifically to emergency action plans, but in many ways they're applicable to gaining support for any type of safety program or initiative that you're implementing. These practices are a result of my personal experience, nearly 2 decades in this field, and are derived from standards as well. In my experiences, as I said, selling management as an internal safety professional and also as a consultant and even as an attorney. An accurate assessment of risk, making sure that we have assessed the risk through a quantifiable means, which we're going to cover in upcoming lectures, quantifying risk. Understanding how the risk relates to the organization is key. Some safety professionals think every issue is the sky is falling issue, and it simply isn't. And sometimes we underplay certain things in order to feel like we're at a bargaining table. An accurate, quantifiable assessment of risk will really go a long way in getting stakeholder buy-in. emphasizing the benefits of the organization's overall sustainability, that this plan is not just for mere protection of life and people, although that is its primary focus and always will be. Each plan should also have attributes and have objectives that protect the organization and making it sustainable over time. Community stewardship, the company's reputation, the organization's reputation in the community, whether it causing damage there or being there still as an employer for the community, is of utmost importance. D, detailed budget, understanding what the emergency action plan is going to cost, and understanding how you might be able to manage certain things when budgets don't go your way. E, engagement that is planned and purposeful. It's a good idea to have committees, and NFPA 1600 contemplates committees, but you can't just get a group of people together. You have to think about what these committees and the folks that you invite to provide feedback into the development process are going to do. It should be structured not such that it restricts thought and input, but that it's purposeful, it's engaging, and it's planned. F, foster a sense of urgency. With no other program I can think of, is there any more urgency than being prepared for an emergency? Now, granted, emergency action plans, like any other thing, develop and should be continuously improved over time, but there's always a sense of urgency to have a plan in place to address those things that, because of our risk assessment, are of highest risk to the organization. And finally, I choose to not make this my go-to or right out of the gate means of gaining stakeholder buy-in, but the got-to, or legal reasons, the standards that are involved, making sure you know what applies to your organization, how it applies to your organization, and what you must do to comply will go a long way in the meetings with senior management leadership. Really knowing your stuff as it pertains to the scope and applicability of each of the standards and what it takes to comply will go a long way. Because reading OSHA standards, EPA standards is not necessarily rocket science, and senior executives can read those too. And if you don't know your stuff cold, it can really hurt your credibility. So that's the A, B, C, D, E, F, G that I've synthesized down, and